Revelation, Sri Ramana Hridayam by K. Lakshmana Sarma. Unto that transcendental being, the unborn self, shining in the heart, in every creature as the limitless I, the Guru of all Gurus, my real self and Lord, who has lovingly assumed human form with intent to unfold his own true nature to his devotees, namely Sri Ramana, I render obeisance. Translating into Sanskrit the work which Ramana the sage composed in Tamil for his devotees' delight, one of his humble devotees, sustained by his grace, composed this work named Ramana Hridayam in easy style for the peace of his own mind. The sun of pure consciousness, namely this work of the great sage, which aspirants to the state of deliverance should study constantly, is most excellent, conferring beatitude in the state of pure consciousness, the state transcending speech and mind, without mental taints, attaining which the sage no more returns to bondage, and also giving present delight to those that study it. Can there be sense of existence without something that is? Is real consciousness a thing other than that? Since that reality dwells thought-free in the heart, how can it itself named the heart be meditated on? And who is there distinct from it to meditate on it? The self whose nature is reality consciousness. Know that to meditate on it is just to be at one with it within the heart. Men of pure minds who intensely fear death surrender themselves unto the Lord of all, the blissful one, the indwelling self, who has no death nor birth. By that surrender, their ego, along with their attachments, becomes extinguished. How can they who thus have one abode in immortality have any thought of death? Since we see the world, it follows that there does exist a source of it, a sole reality transcending world and mind, of whose power all this is a becoming. This is beyond dispute. This cinema show of names and forms, their sustaining screen, the light of consciousness, and the spectator, all these four are only that Supreme Being who is the real self within the heart. All the faiths that prevail in the world affirm, to begin with, the existence of the world, the soul, and God. The two contentions, namely, that one reality is sensed as threefold, and that they are three distinct entities, are upheld as intellectual convictions, while the sense I am the body persists. But the highest state is being firmly established in one's own real nature as the real self by giving up that delusion. Of what use is it to affirm the world is real? It is an illusory appearance. It is endued with consciousness. It is inert. It is happy. It is surely miserable. That state of egolessness, transcending the creeds of duality and unity, which is our own by nature, and which is to be won by turning away from the world and experiencing the real self, is dear to all alike. If the self have form, then the world and God also would have form. But since the self is formless, by whom and how are forms to be seen? Can what is seen be of a different nature from the seeing eye? The real I is just the real self, and that I is infinite, unconditioned, worldless, without a second. Since everybody in the world comprises 5 sheaths, all the 5 sheaths together answer to the name of body. Such being the case, say, does the world really exist apart from the body? Say, is the world seen by anyone without a body? The world has no form apart from the objects of sense, namely sounds and the rest. Thus, the whole universe is just sensations of the 5 sense organs. Through these 5 sense organs, the one mind knows the world. That being so, say, is the world other than the mind? The two, the universe and the mind, arise and set as one. Yet, this inert universe is lighted up by the mind alone. Know that that sole, unborn, infinite being, whose nature is pure consciousness, and in which the two, the universe and the mind, arise and set, but which itself neither rises nor sets, is alone real. Even though to worship Him in any form and by any name is a means towards the right vision of Him, who really is without form and name. True vision of Him consists in being at one with Him, by merging in Him, the transcendental being, through the realization of the identity of the real self with His real essence. The triads all arise depending on the ego sense. So too arise the duads. If one enters the heart by the quest of who is the I, and sees the truth of it, the real self, all of them vanish utterly. Such a one is the sage. He is not deluded by them. Knowledge is never and nowhere in the world separate from ignorance. Neither is ignorance at any time and for anyone separate from knowledge. True knowledge is the awareness of the original self, which becomes manifest by the quest. Who is this I, to whom belong both of these? Nothing else. How can the knowledge of objects arising in relative existence to one that knows not the truth of himself, the knower, be true knowledge? If one rightly knows the truth of him in whom both knowledge and its opposite subsist, then along with ignorance, relative knowledge also will cease once for all. Know that that alone is true knowledge, in which there is neither knowledge nor ignorance. The so-called knowledge of objects, understand, is not at all true knowledge. The real self shines always alone, with neither things for him to know, nor persons to know him. Therefore, he is only consciousness. Do not think that he is non-being. This self, here declared to be consciousness, is alone real, without a second. All knowledge, which is manifold, is only ignorance. This ignorance, which, being a negation, is non-existent, has no existence apart from the self, who is consciousness. Say, do the unreal jewels exist apart from the gold, which alone exists? The two, namely, you and he, appear when the sense of I has risen in respect of a body. If, by the quest of the self by oneself, by the question, what is the truth behind this I, the ego be extinguished, therewith are also lost the other two notions. That which then shines alone, understand, is the real self. Both past and future exist only in dependence on the present. Each in its own time is only present. Therefore, all the three are present. That being so, research into the past and the future without experience of the reality in the present time, won by the quest, is absurd, like counting without the number one. Do time and space exist apart from the ego? If we were bodies, then we would be subject to them. But say, are we bodies? Because the true self is the same everywhere and at all times. Therefore, learn that he is the sole reality, consuming both time and space. The body is the self, both to him that does not know the self and to him that knows. The one that knows not believes himself to be limited to the body and distinct from God the All. To the knower of the real self within, he shines as the infinite being, not other than God. Great indeed is the difference between the knower of the self and the non-knower. The world is real both to the non-knower and to the knower of the real. He that lacks knowledge of the real believes the real to be coextensive with the world. To the knower, the real shines as formless one, the basic substance of the world. Great indeed is the difference between the knower of that and the non-knower. Only those love to dispute which of the two, fate and free will prevail, who have no experience of the truth of him named I, who is the one root of both. Can that sage that has become free of both, knowing the truth of the ego by the quest, ever again become entangled in these, like one that knows not the self? When one sees a form of God, neglecting himself the seer, that vision is vision of a mental form. It is not a true vision of God. Does the sage that has direct vision of the self see that supreme being, who is that real self? Having lost the ego, he, the sage, is not at all distinct from him. Two visions are mentioned in the sacred lore, namely, vision of the self and vision of God. I shall state what they really mean. How can there be vision of the self, since he cannot be seen, for the reason that he is one with the would-be seer, who is to see God, who is just the real self, and how? Know that the vision of the self and the vision of God alike consist in the soul, that is, the ego, becoming the food of God. This blissful and transcendental being, who is pure consciousness, is ever shining within the mind as himself the real self, imparting to the mind whatever light of consciousness it has. Such being the case, how can a man know him by the mind alone, failing to merge the mind in him by turning it inwards? The body, being devoid of consciousness, has no egoism of its own. No one ever says, I did not exist in dreamless sleep. All things come into being when this I is risen. Therefore, search with concentrated mind for the source wherefrom this ego sense arises. The inert body cannot say I. The real consciousness has no beginning. Between them comes to birth an I limited to the body. This is the mind, the knot between consciousness and the inert body. Conditioned existence, the ego, bondage, and the subtle body. This is the true nature of the so-called soul. This phantom without a form, the ego, comes into being, taking hold of a form, a body. Keeping hold of the form, it continues to exist. Keeping hold of the form and enjoying sense objects, it greatly waxes in strength. Giving up a form at death, it takes hold of a new one. When the truth of it is sought, it will surely run away. When this thing known as I is risen, then rises all this world. When the I is not, neither does the world exist. Therefore, this I is itself all the world. Therefore, extinction of the I by the quest of who is this I, or whence is he, is to get rid of the whole world. We are that one reality only, in that state in which there is no rising of the ego sense. But how can the ego sense be finally extinguished? If the mind does not enter the source of the ego sense, and if the ego sense be not so extinguished, how can that state be one, which is our own by nature, and in which we are that? As one dives into a lake, seeking something fallen into it, so should one dive into the heart with a one-pointed mind, restraining speech and the breath, giving up all thought about the world and seeking whence does arise the ego sense, and thus should become aware of the real self, the transcendental being. Diving into the heart, restraining both speech and mind, and seeking where shines the original I consciousness, is the direct means of winning the awareness of the self. The meditation, I am not this body, I am myself that, is useful only as a preliminary to the quest. Is it itself the quest of the self? When the mind, introverted by being engaged in the quest of who am I, is lost in the heart, and the ego bows his head in shame, there shines by its own light a pure consciousness as the limitless I. That consciousness is not the spurious ego. It is the transcendental, infinite reality. It is the blissful, real self. Does there remain anything needing to be done by him that is happy in unity with that? The unity which becomes manifest by consuming the ego sense, the state of peace and bliss beyond relativity. Since he knows nothing other than the self, how can anyone not so delivered imagine what that mindless state is like? Instead of winning one's own natural state, the state which is taught by revelation, by the words, "Thou art that," by entering the heart, by the quest of who am I, man goes on meditating, I am that. I am not the body. Because of mental weakness, that reality is itself, ever shining as the self. The two statements, I do not know myself and I know myself, are equally ridiculous. Has anyone, anywhere, two selves? So that the self can become an object of knowledge of himself. Know from the common experience of all men alike that the real self is only one. The man blinded by the ego, who by seeking that reality, which is ever shining in the hearts of all creatures as the real self, has not become aware of it, and thereby attained his own natural state of oneness with it, disputes saying, there is something real. No, that something has form. No, it is one. It is twofold. It is neither. To be the real self in the heart by winning the actual experience of that self, which is already won, is the real gain. All other gains are like those that are won in a dream. Does anything gained in a dream remain true on waking? Is the one that has cast off falsehood by dwelling in the real ever again deluded by these? So long as the notion I am the body prevails, the meditation I am that is helpful to the winning of self-awareness by the quest. But why should this meditation be kept up endlessly? Does any man meditate, I am a man? We are always that reality. Even the statement that duality is real, so long as one is striving to reach the goal, but that in the goal there is non-duality, is not at all correct. What else but the 10th man was the man in the parable, both when he himself was anxiously seeking for the 10th man as one that was missing, and when he had found him to be that missing 10th man? If the self were ever himself the doer of actions, then he himself would reap their consequences. But when the sense of doership drops away on the realization of the infinite self, as a result of the quest, who am I that is a doer of action? With it, namely the sense of doership, will drop away all the three kinds of actions. The wise know this state to be eternal. If there be the thought, I am bound, then will arise also the thought of deliverance, when by the quest of who am I that is bound, the ever free real self alone remains, ageless and deathless. To whom can the thought of bondage come? If that thought cannot arise, then how can the thought of deliverance arise to the sage who has done with actions? I shall here state clearly the truth among the three contentions, that deliverance is with form, that it is without form and that it is both ways. True deliverance is just the utter extinction of him named I, who thus investigates the truth among these contentions. That is the real, the secret treasure in the heart, in which alone this world exists, to which this entire world belongs, from which it comes into existence, for the realization of which alone it is, by which the world appears, and which itself is all the world. We meditate on that transcendental reality within the heart. By associating with a sage, a man attains non-attachment. By non-attachment, he is delivered from the delusion, I am the body, that is in the mind. When he is free from delusion, he becomes one with the moveless, transcendental reality, and becomes free while still alive. Cultivate his society. That transcendental state of bliss, which may be won by men through the quest of the self, culminating in the diving of the mind into the heart, which is prompted by association with a sage, is not attainable by intellectual grasp of the sense of the sacred lore, by listening to the talks of lectures, by different kinds of acts of merit, nor by any other means. To that fortunate one who habitually associates with sages with a devout mind, of what use are all these observances for winning the highest goal? When the cool south wind blows, giving relief from heat, say, what is the use of keeping a fan in the hand? The moon can allay heat alone for men. Likewise, the celestial wishing tree can relieve want alone. So too, the sacred river Ganga can remove only sin. By the sight of sages, all the three, heat and the rest, are extinguished. So, there is nothing in all the three worlds comparable to them. The holy bathing places, which are but water, are never equal to those great ones, nor are the deity forms made of stone or earth, which are worshipped. Through these, a man gets purity of mind. If he has devotion after immeasurable time, by the sight of sages, he may become pure at once. Who is God? The one that knows the mind. But I myself, as the individual soul, am always knowing the mind. Therefore, thou art thyself God, not an individual. Besides, Revelation itself says that God is the one self in all creatures. What is the light for thee, for seeing objects? By day, the sun; by night, lamps and the like. What is the light for seeing these? The eye. What is the light for seeing that? The mind. By what light dost thou perceive the mind? I myself perceive it. Therefore, thou art thyself the light of all lights, infinite and transcending all. True, I am that. Inside the cave of the heart, the pure and infinite being himself shines as the self, the limitless I. Enter thou the heart, diving by the quest of the self, or by holding the breath, and thus be one with the self. That same pure, motionless consciousness which shines inside the lotus of the heart as I will itself grant deliverance if man gives up the sense of I am the body. The body, like anything made of earth, is insentient. It has no sense of I. Therefore, I am not that. Also, because it is certain that the self exists in dreamless sleep, in which there is no body. Who is he that says I? Or whence is he? To those that with pure mind, seeking the self in this way, become established in the self, the blissful, perfect being, namely Arunachala, himself shines as I. That man of elevated mind who becomes born in his own cause, namely the transcendental being, through the quest whence am I, is alone really born. He is born once for all. That Lord of sages is ever new. Give up the sense of I in this body, which is not the self, being inert and full of imperfections, and win experience of the real self, the transcendental reality, which is endless bliss. The man that hopes to know the self with mind intent on nourishing the body is just like a man trying to cross a river, taking hold of an alligator, mistaking it for a log of wood. The extinction of the sense of I am the body is itself gift, sacrifice, tapas, righteousness, truthfulness, the grace of God, union with God, supreme devotion, renunciation, silence, the natural state, happiness, wealth, deliverance, peace, the death which is not death, and right knowledge. To whom do these, namely action, separation from God, separation from the reality, and ignorance of the true self belong? This inquiry is itself all the yogas of action and the rest. Know that that state is the untainted real existence, the blissful experience of the self, in which there is neither the seeker named I, nor the four named above, action and the rest. He that seeks to win supernormal powers, not knowing that he himself is activated by the power of God, is like that cripple who said, "What effort would it be for me to defeat these foes, if only you would raise me up and place me in the battlefield in front of them?" Perfect stillness of the mind is declared by the sages to be deliverance. Powers are to be won by more than common efforts of the mind. How can the man who is so unintelligent as to seek to win those powers win the timeless happiness of deliverance, which is the same as quiescence of mind. While God Himself is bearing all the burden of the world, the imitation soul that tries to bear their burden is just like the carted figure sculpted at the base of a tower, appearing to sustain the tower on its head. If one that travels by a car that can carry heavy loads bears his luggage on his own head and suffers pain in consequence, who is to blame for this? Among the 6 organs of various colors situated above the belly, there is one, the heart, resembling a lily bud, 2 finger breadths from the center of the chest. Its mouth is closed. In the space within it, there are the chief nerves. It is the abode of darkness, of the acquired mental habits, the vital force, the mind, and the light, namely consciousness. The Supreme Being, dwelling inside the cave of the heart, is called the Lord of the heart. If, by meditating, I myself am He, the conviction I am He becomes as firmly established as is now the conviction I am the body, then ignorance will vanish, just as darkness does before the sun. What is the truth of the heart in all creatures, reflected in which, as in a mirror, is seen all the universe, as if outside? When thus Rama questioned him, Bhagavan Vashishta replied as follows: the heart should be known as twofold, one to be rejected and another to be accepted. The fleshy organ of the body, inert and subject to decay, should be understood as the one to be rejected. The heart, which is pure consciousness, in which the universe is reflected, and which is quite other than the last mentioned, should be known as the one to be accepted. It is both outside and inside, and it is neither outside nor inside. It is the storehouse of all good things for all creatures. When the mind attains fixity in this, the real heart, by the quest of the self, there occurs the extinction of all mental taints, and the vital air ceases to move also. Cast off all attachments from the mind by constantly meditating, I am that taintless, blissful consciousness which ever shines untrammeled by the body sheets. Keeping mental hold of that state of reality which remains over after inquiry into the truth of all states of being. Act in the world like one that is governed by desires, without being really subject to them. Thou knowest the immortal truth behind all these appearances. Keeping hold of that outlook, be active in the world like one swayed by desire, but with mind at peace. Putting on a false appearance of joy, of excitement, of disapproval, and of eagerness to achieve, perform the duties of the world, internally free from the hundreds of binding desires, and evenly disposed to all creatures. Engage in actions suiting the disguise of manhood, just like an ignorant person. He that by self-experience has entered on his natural state of pure consciousness and is ever happy in oneness with that reality, having shed all the taints of the mind, should be known as the unborn one, the wielder of the thunderbolt of self-awareness, the fire of pure consciousness, the hero that has killed death, and the god of death to time itself. Just as in springtime there comes to trees an increase of beauty and other qualities, so too the seer of the truth, who is contented in the enjoyment of the bliss of the self, there comes surely an increase of light, power, and intelligence. Just as a man whose mind has wandered far while listening to a story does not really hear, so the sage who acts without mental taint does not become a doer by doing actions. On the other hand, if the mind be imbued with abundance of worldly taints, then that man is a doer of actions, even when he is outwardly inactive. See, a dreamer falls from a hilltop into an abyss, even while his body lies moveless in bed. Just as for one that has gone to sleep in a carriage, the three states, namely the movements of the carriage, its standing still somewhere, and its being left with the horses unyoked, are all alike, so too the sage that is in sleep of self-awareness, in the carriage, namely the body, the three states, namely the activity of the body, its inactivity in samadhi and sleep, are all alike. The peaceful and timeless state of the sage, called waking sleep, which to those that live in the vicious circle of waking, dream, and dreamless sleep is termed the fourth state, is alone real. The other three are merely false appearances. Therefore, the wise ones call that state, which is pure consciousness, the state of transcendental being. To the dull-witted, it is said, the actions of the future and those that are gathered into the reserve belonging to the sage become lost, but not so those that have begun to yield fruit. But just as one wife out of many does not remain a sumangali at the death of the husband, so all the three divisions of actions are lost when the doer, the ego, dies. Men with little book knowledge have only one family each, consisting of wife, sons, and others. But clever and learned men have in their hearts many families, namely books, which are hindrances to spiritual effort. How can there be deliverance for them? If one with a knowledge of literature does not seek to erase the writing of fate by the quest of whence is this I that knows literature, say, what has been gained by him by the knowledge of literature? Who else is there? O Lord Arunachala, so like gramophone, those ills that exist for that learned man who has not one peace of mind do not exist for the illiterate one. The latter is not possessed by the demon pride. He does not suffer the pain of vocal or mental effort, nor does he wander about in search of honor. Know thou that he is saved from not one but many ills. Even for those that look on the whole world as worthless and have all the secrets of the sacred lore in the palm of the hand, it is impossible to cast off servitude to the harlot praise. Who is there other than the self If someone says anything about oneself, whether in praise or censure, what matters it? It is just as if it was said by oneself. In the case of the sage, who, firmly established in his own natural state of bliss, which is unforfeitable, is unaware of the difference between himself and another. Meditate always on the truth that is without a second, but never seek to apply the teaching of non-duality to actions in the worldly life. My son, meditate on this truth as covering all the universe, but never do so in respect of the Guru. I shall now set forth unmistakably the profound secret which is the supreme essence of the conclusions of the Upanishads. Understand that when the self is realized as the reality by the death of the ego, there remains only that real self, who is pure consciousness. The universe, diversified as the seer and his spectacle, has its rising interval of manifestation and setting along with the mind. It appears in the states of dream and waking. In dreamless sleep, it disappears. Thus, the whole universe is just the mind's thoughts and nothing more, that constantly shining one in which the mind has its existence is the real self, untouched by unhappiness. Not thus knowing his own real self and thinking through the power of the delusion, I am the body, that the world is real and that happiness can be had from sense objects. The ignorant one suffers unhappiness. If, turning away from the world, he dives into the heart by the quest of the self, he shall attain peace in the real self. So teaches Bhagavan Sri Ramana in this book.